On this video, I would like to continue. On this video, I would like to continue doing an analysis of the Greek text grammatically of Revelation, and we're in Revelation 11, followed by commentary in which we suggest the different ideas that have been shared concerning the meaning of the text. So I'm going to do the grammar first in the reading of the Greek. We're looking now at the tabernacle and looking probably at the church, and symbolically speaking, and the Lord's protection and the two witnesses and what all this might mean. So we begin, kai adathe moi, kalamas hoimaas rabdo. And there was given to me a measuring rod like a staff. And as we look at this particular phrase, let me just parse it first. Adathe is from didomi, aorist indicative passive, third person singular from didomi. And so he sees a rod, like a measuring rod. And it's like to a staff. It is interesting that in the work by Cleon Rogers, Dr. Cleon Rogers, he makes a reference to that particular verse. And let me just read the reference about the reed. This served for a surveyor's rule and measuring rod, and it might have been the cane, which grows along Jordan Valley and was known as the giant reed of Mediterranean lands. It grows in swampy areas, and sometimes it may reach the height of 12 or even 15 or 20 feet. And Dr. Rogers is quoting Ford here on page 171. So there's going to be a measurement, and notice the text continues, legon, egere kai metresan tan naan tu seu, kai tu thusiasterion, kai tus pras kuntas in alto. And notice saying, legon is a present participle, nominative masculine singular from lego, saying, arise and measure the temple of God. Egera is from agero, and here we have an imperative, a present imperative from agero, arise, and metresan, measure, from metreo, aorist imperative, second person singular from metreo, measure the temple of God and the altar and the ones who are worshiping in it. Proskununtas is from proskuneo. It's the present participle, accusative plural from proskuneo. So measure the temple and the altar and the worshipers in it. But then he goes on, kai tain alain tain exothen, tu nau ekpale exothen kai me altain metreses. Hate adathe tois ethnisen kai tain palen, tain hagion, patesusin menas tessarakantas rakanta kai duo. That is, and the uh, court, which is outside of the temple, cast outside. In other words, don't measure it. And ekbale is from ekbalo. It's the aorist imperative, second masculine singular from ekbalo. Cast outside and do not measure. Metreses is from metreo. It's the aorist subjunctive, second person singular from metreo. And here we have an imperative, a prohibition. So do not measure hate because edathe tois ethnicin. It has been given to the nation. Edathe is from didomi, aorist indicative, third person singular, aorist indicative passive, third person singular from didomi. So it has been given to the nations and the holy city, they shall tread down for 42 months. Patre susin is the future indicative active, a third person plural from pateo, to tread down. So they shall tread down the holy city for 42 months, or 3.5 years. And this sort of would remind the readers of the book of Daniel, and especially the reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. It is interesting, just reading a note from the commentary Breaking the Code, which I appreciate a lot. On page 69, it says we're talking about a limited time in which the church is struggling and being trampled over, and yet it cannot be destroyed. But we are also limiting it to 3.5 years here, as we see. And it's the traditional apocalyptic term of Gentile domination, Metzger writes, derived from Daniel 9:27 and 12:7, which basically is looking at its primary reference to the time of defilement of the temple by the abomination that desolates. That would be Antiochus IV from 167 to 164 BC. So the period of time would be 42 months, or 1,260 days, during which we'll see two witnesses that will be exercising their ministry. And so the reference seems to go back then to that reference to Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the 3.5 years. Now, some interpreters apply this to the future tribulation period, the first 3.5 years. Metzger understands it to be an apocalyptic, symbolic representation, going back to Antiochus Epiphanes, going back to Daniel, that has reference to the persecution that the church was going through under emperor worship, much like what had happened under Antiochus Epiphanes, continues through time. And that doesn't just stop there, but through history. I think that would be more Metzger's point of view and the view of others as well. And so we move on to verse 3. Kaidoso tois, dusin martusin mu, kai prophetususin, chimeras, kilias diakasias, exekanta, peri beblemenoi sakus. That is, and I will give to my witnesses, my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,000, notice 260 days, or 3.5 years, clothed in sackcloth, having been clothed in sackcloth. Doso is your future indicative active, first person singular from didomi, and prophetususin is the future indicative active, third person plural from prophetuo. So I will give to my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy, the ability to share in a prophetic word for 1,000, which actually would be 1,260 for 3.5 years. Going back again to Antiochus Epiphanes as a symbolic representation of the suffering that the church is going through, would be, I believe, Metzger's point of view there. And others apply it to the future, to the 7-year tribulation period, which they see from Daniel. It goes on to say, and they shall prophesy, prophetususin, again, as we said, the future indicative active, third person plural, for 1,260 days, peribeblemenoi, having been wrapped around or clothed in sackcloth. Peribalo is the root, peribalomai, and here we have a perfect passive participle, nominative masculine plural. And so we're looking at sackcloth was what the prophets would often wear, calling people to repentance and so forth. So we see this, and then he talks about these two witnesses. Hutoi esin kai duo elioi kai duo lukniai kai enopion tu kiriu tes gaze estotas. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands which are before the Lord, standing before the Lord of the earth. A scene is your present indicative active, third person plural from a me. And these are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks which are standing. Chestotes is from histemi. It's a perfect participle, nominative, masculine plural from histemi, which are standing before the Lord of the earth. Now, this is a very difficult passage. Let me just read the verse concerning the identification. Kai e tis autus thele adikesai pur ek paruatai ek tu stomatas auton, kai katesthe tus ectrus auton, kai etis delese autus adekesai hutos de auton apakton thena. And that is, and if anyone is willing to hurt them, thele is your present indicative active, third person singular from thelo, and adekesai is from adekeo. It's the aorist active infinitive. So if anyone desires to hurt them, then fire ek paruatai ek tu stomatas. Fire is going out of their mouth. Ekparuatai is from ekparuamai, present indicative middle, third person singular. So fire is going out of their mouth, kai katesthe, and it is devouring from katestheo, present indicative active, third person singular, their enemies. And if anyone wills to hurt them, notice they say is the aorist subjunctive, third person singular from thelo. So if anyone should be willing or is willing to hurt them, adikesai from adikeo is your aorist infinitive active from adikeo. Thus, it is necessary for him to be killed. Apaktanthenon. This is the aorist from apakteno, the aorist infinitive passive from apakteno. And so what we're seeing here is fire coming out of their mouth and devouring the adversaries. I think we clearly must see this as symbolic. We don't see literal fire coming out of somebody's mouth, but it is a symbol of God's judgment coming out of their mouth. To try to take this literally is sort of like the lamb standing, and yet it was slain. In other words, or Christ coming back on a white horse. I mean, we see symbolism in apocalyptic literature all the way through. And we're seeing it here. And these two witnesses then basically have fire coming out of their mouth, no doubt looking symbolically at their words that devour and bring judgment. And then he goes on to say, hutoi ekusin tain exousion klesai tan uranan. These are having the authority to close heaven. From kleo, we have the aorist active infinitive from kleo. So they have the authority to close heaven in order that, and this goes back to the Old Testament again, and what happens, remember the prophet said it would not rain and so forth. And so in order to close heaven, in order that it might not rain, breke is your present subjunctive, third person singular from breko, the days of their prophesying, and they have authority, ekusin, present indicative active, third person plural, over the waters to turn. Straphein is your present active infinitive from strapho, to turn them into blood. We're reminded of the Exodus and what happened with Moses. Kai pataxai tain gain, and to smite the earth. Pataxai is from patasso, to smite, it's the aorist active infinitive, to smite the earth with every plague whatsoever they might desire. The lesusin is from thelo, aorist again, subjunctive, active third person plural. So the question that has been asked is, who in the world are these witnesses? And I appreciated what Metzger said at the beginning of the discussion of this chapter on page 68 in Breaking the Code. He says, what follows in chapter 11 has been generally acknowledged to be one of the most perplexing sections of the entire book. There is presented here an almost bewildering interweaving of symbols suggested by Old Testament history and prophecy. We find reference to the temple and the altar, to Moses and Elijah, uh, to the wild olive trees and the lampstand seen in Zechariah, to the plagues sent upon Pharaoh, and to the tyrant predicted by Daniel. We talked about Antiochus Epiphanes, and to Sodom and Egypt and Jerusalem. And so he concludes, perhaps the most that can be said with confidence is that the author views the people of God as bearing testimony, but also as suffering pain and persecution and indignity. They are delivered not from martyrdom and death, but through martyrdom and death to a glorious resurrection, which he comes to at the end of this chapter. Nevertheless, beyond such a very general understanding of the passage, some features of Revelation here 11 can be clarified by the patient expositor who seeks to discriminate between what is to be understood literally and what is to be understood symbolically. And we've said this before, that there has to be, I think, a symbolic understanding, because fire does not literally come out of the mouth of any human being, but the fire can picture the Word of God, which is like a fire that brings judgment and so forth. So, at any rate, he is going back to these Old Testament images describing these two witnesses from Moses and Elijah. And like we said, some want to apply it to Joshua and Zerubbabel, which is applicable as well, but also to Moses and Elijah. And so what we're looking at is that God is now likening, it appears, the church to carrying out a dual witness, fulfilling the law and the prophets, with Christ in the church, who is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. It is interesting that the idea of a temple is found in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians, we see that, chapter 3. We are the temple of God. Christians are. We see that in 1 Peter, chapter 2. And the fact that he is not measuring the outside, but the inside, seems to mean he is concerned about protecting eternally, let's say, the people of God. Those on the outside are the persecutors of the church. And again, the commentary that I appreciate, Bruce Metzger, on page 69, makes that statement. Those on the outside are the persecutors of the church, who will trample over the holy city for 42 months. The holy city representing the church again. Jerusalem becoming a picture of the people of God and the holy city. But they are not permitted to destroy the church, but only to oppress it for a limited period of time, for 3.5 years. And we talked about the reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. That time is limited, in which they are able to oppress the church. So as we look at this chapter, he goes on to talk about how there's martyrdom of the two witnesses is likened to that of Christ in Jerusalem, and which is really the great city allegorically that the prophets speak of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it symbolizes moral decay and oppression, which was going on in the Roman Empire against the early believers, and has gone on really through human history and is going on today and will go on until the Lord returns, seems to be the thought. But then he talks about their bodies, how they're being persecuted, and their bodies will lie looking at the human indignity that's going on. So as we move on, notice it says, and when telesosine, when they fulfill their witness, the beast who comes out of the abyss, notice ta therion ta anabainon, ektes abusu poiese met auton, palamon kai nekese autus kai apaktene autus. That is, and when they complete their witness, when they shall complete, here we have the aorist subjunctive third person plural from teleo, the beast who comes out on a bainon. We have a participle neuter, nominative singular from anabino. The beast who comes out of the abyss will make war with them. Ese is your future indicative active third person singular from poieo, and will conquer them. Nikese, again, future indicative active third person singular from nikao, to conquer, and shall kill them. Apaktene, future indicative active, again, third person singular from apakteno. And notice their body will lie in the broad place in the street. Kaita betoma auton ep tes plateas tes palaos tes megales. Hetes kaletai pneumatikos sadoma kai aguptas hapus kai hakurias auton estal rothe. That is, their body shall be in the broad place, the great city, which is called spiritually Sodom and Gomorrah. And this goes back to the Hebrew scriptures where the prophet called Jerusalem Sodom and Gomorrah in Isaiah chapter 1, and where the Lord was crucified. That is Jerusalem. Now, the picture here is not limited, though, to Jerusalem. It's showing where Christ was crucified. And in a sense, taking the idea of the church and Christ in the church, Christ is still attacked. And through the church, the law and the prophets are fulfilled in the indwelling Christ in the church. So as we move on, one interpretation then is that these two witnesses represent the church, the temple of God, in which church, and he has fulfilled the law and the prophets. He has fulfilled all of the references here, and the church is being persecuted by the Roman Emperor Domitian, but it's also looking, no doubt, at the church being persecuted through history. So the two witnesses then symbolically, with this interpretation, depict the church and Christ in the church being attacked as the one who is fulfilling all of these Old Testament prophets through the ministry of the church. And as the church is preaching, it's like fire going out of their mouth against those that are persecuting the church, announcing the judgment that is to come. So as we go on, kai blepusi ek ton laon, kai fulon, kai gloson, kai ethnon, kai patoma auton, chimeras tres, kai hemeso, kai ta patoma ta auton, uk afet esin tethenai es nema. That is, and they shall see out of peoples and tribes and tongues and nations their bodies for 3.5 days, and their bodies will not be permitted to be placed in burial or in a tomb. Notice here, blepusin is your present indicative active third person singular from blepo. They shall see worldwide now. It's not just limited to Jerusalem, but can we say Jerusalem is becoming symbolic of where Christ suffered and the church is suffering in a spiritual Jerusalem, meaning in the world system now. And this is encompassing all peoples and tribes and tongues and nations. And the body of these witnesses does not even have a burial, which is the worst thing that can happen when one dies in the ancient world. And it says that for 3.5 days, their corpses are not permitting to be placed into a tomb for burial. Notice here, afit usin is from afit emi, present indicative active third person plural, and tethenai is your aorist passive infinitive from tithemi. And so they're suffering horrible indignity. And certainly the church that John's writing to was suffering tremendous indignity and persecution under Domitian. And if they were unwilling to speak of him as Lord, they would be persecuted. But this is going on all through time as well. So, in a very real sense, this interpretation or this suggested interpretation of the church here and Christ bearing witness through the church, fulfilling the law and the prophets and all of these images, the church is suffering in this world. And then we go on, kai hoi katoi kuntes epi tes geis kairusin ep altois. And those who dwell upon the earth, they shall rejoice over them, over the suffering. Katoi kuntes is from katoi keo. It is your present participle nominative masculine plural, and it's looking at earthling, at the earth dwellers, opposite the followers of Christ. So those that are dwelling down upon the earth, they shall rejoice over what's happening to the two martyrs, which, if we take it to be Christ in the church, fulfilling all of these pictures, the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, Zerubbabel and Joshua, the church then fulfilling that in that Christ is in the church and the church is suffering. So we go on that they rejoice over them and they shall be glad and shall send gifts to one another. Euphreinantai, they are being glad, present indicative passive, or present middle participle, present indicative middle, third person plural, from euphraino. They shall be glad, and they shall send dora gifts to one another. Pimpsusin is your future indicative active third person plural from pimpo, because these two prophets Hate hutoi hoi duo prophetai ebasanesan tus katoikuntas epites gates. Because these two prophets, uh, ebasanesan, the ones who are dwelling upon the earth, uh, in other words, they have, can I say, tormented the ones who are dwelling upon the earth by their prophetic words. And again, tus katoi kuntas is your participle aorist, present plural, accusative plural from katoi keo. And furthermore, and with or after 3 days and a half, kai meta tas tres chimeras kai chemeso pneuma zoes ek tu seu exeothen in autois kai chestesan epitus padas autun ton kai phabas megas epepisen epitus de oruntas autus. That is, um, and after 3 days, we're going back to the imagery of Christ, who was 3 days in burial in the tomb. So after 3.5 days, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, a Seothin, meaning the two witnesses. And if we take the idea, and at least this is one interpretation, that this is the church in which Christ bears these two witnesses through the church. That is, the church cannot be wiped out. In other words, the spirit of life, uh, after 3.5 days, much like what happened to Jesus now, is being relived in the history of the Roman church in Asia Minor. And then, through time, after 3.5 days, it entered into them. That is, the spirit of life entered into them. A self then is from asertomai, aorist indicative active, third person singular. And heste son, they stood upon their feet. Kai heste son epitus padas auton. That is, they arose. They stood upon their feet. And if one is following the idea of the church here, the church cannot be defeated. There may be times throughout, and there are times throughout history where the church is brutally treated, but it continues to stand on its feet because Christ is in the church. And heste sin is the aorist indicative active third person plural from heste me, and great fear epepisin epitus theoruntas autus. Great fear fell upon those who were beholding these things. Notice epepicin is from epipipto, aorist indicative active third person singular, and so great fear fell upon those who were beholding the oruntas them. And what was happening? The oruntas is your present participle accusative plural from theoreo. And so there is awe and fear at the constant revitalization of the church then, if one takes this interpretation. And they heard kai ekusan phones megales ektu uranu leguses autois anabate hodeb kai anebesan es tan uranan inte nefele kai et orasan autus hoi ektroi auton. That is, they heard a great voice out of heaven saying to them, come up here. Ekusan is your aorist indicative active third person plural from Akuo. So they heard a great voice out of heaven, Legu says, saying, is your present participle feminine singular, genitive singular from Lego, saying to them, come up here, looking again at the resurrection of the church, the revitalization for those that follow this interpretation. Anabata is your aorist imperative, second masculine plural from anabino, and they came up into heaven in a cloud. Anebesan is from anabino, again, aorist indicative active, third person plural. And they beheld them, that is, their enemies beheld them. Ores resan is from theoreo, aorist indicative active, third person plural. So they're caught up to heaven. In other words, the church is constantly resurrected, so to speak. And the enemies of the church are beholding this ongoing resurrection that's taking place. The church cannot be destroyed because Christ is in the church. And then, verse 13, Kai en akene te hora, agenata seismas megas, kai ta dekatan tes palaos episin kai epektanthesan in to seismo anamata anthropon kiliades hepta kai hoi lepoi imfaboi agenanta kai edokan doxan to theo to uranu. That is, and in that hour of the church's revitalization, or some might apply this even to the second coming of Christ, that the church's destiny is to hear the trumpet and be caught up. And this could be applied that way too, it would seem, in that hour of Christ's return. So John then would be encouraging the church that there's coming a time when Christ will return. The church will continue to be revitalized, not only from John's perspective, if we take that point of view, and what the church was going through then, but through time, culminating in the great second advent of Christ, because John will deal with that more in chapter 19 and 20. So in that hour, there was, agenata is your aorist indicative middle, third person singular from genomai. There was a great earthquake, and the tenth of the city fell. Epicen from pipto, your aorist indicative active, third person singular, and they were killed. Epectantheson, aorist indicative passive, third person plural from apoctano. They were killed in the earthquake, 1,000, notice anamata men, 7,000, I should say, men, meaning a goodly amount, were judged, and the rest became fearful. Hoi loipoi imfaboi agenanta. Agenanta is your aorist indicative middle, third person plural from genomai. And they gave glory to the God of heaven. Edokan is your aorist indicative active, third person plural from didomi. Now, this is very difficult, and if anyone thinks they have the final interpretation, I would seriously question that. But basically, it seems it's looking at the final return of Christ. And there'll be the earthquake, symbolic of God's presence, and looking at 7,000 men, and the rest were in fear. again, symbolically speaking, there would be quite a few that will stand in awe and fear at this final returning judgment that the Lord brings at his second advent. And they gave glory to the God of heaven. That is, those who are a part of that will give glory to the rest. Let me put it this way: the rest became afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. And some might apply this to a future return of Christ, followed by the millennial reign. If one takes that point of view, those that see this will give glory to the God of heaven. Others would take a different approach, that at the end of time, when Christ returns, there will be those who are beholding it that will bow down and give glory to the God of heaven. And then the first woe is past. He uai he deutera apelthen. Apelthen is your aorist indicative active third person singular from apelkamai, to depart. And the notice the next woe, the second woe, I should say, is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. And this seems to look at the seventh trumpet and the return of Christ and the final judgment that will be talked about in verses 15 and 19 and following. So let me just say, this is a very, very enigmatic section, and commentators differ. And I'm going to say, I'm not saying that I know what the final answer is at all. I'm just trying to share the different perspectives. Someone apply this again to the future tribulation period, and they interpret Daniel 9 to refer to the 7 year tribulation, and the 3.5 years would be the first part of Daniel 9 of the 70 weeks of Daniel, the last 7 weeks, being applied to that. That's a popular viewpoint today. Others, like Metzger, is applying this to the symbolism of what happened under Antiochus Epiphanes and what's happening in the church. Rather than being the future tribulation period alone, it's talking about what the church is going through during the time that John is writing to them, the suffering under emperor worship and Domitian and all of that, and what the church has gone through history, and even leading into the second coming. And others hold that point of view, which I think, in my understanding, would be Metzger's point of view. And I think it's that point of view seems to try to be consistent with the apocalyptic literature and seeing the book of Revelation, uh, the apocalyptic literature, in a symbolic way, much like the bones he had alluded to in Ezekiel that come alive, picturing the restoration of Israel, uh, and so forth. So the point I think that I want to say, this is a very, very difficult uh, chapter, and Metzger admitted that at the very beginning. And I think what needs to be said is scholars will differ, even if they know Greek. It comes down to hermeneutics. It comes down to interpretation. And none of this has anything to do with one's eternal destiny and one's salvation in Jesus Christ. That comes through faith in Him and through His death, burial, and resurrection. But what I think has happened a lot, especially in the evangelical church, they have become very, 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 let's say, taken one interpretation, and anything else is viewed almost as heresy. And I think that's not really being objective to godly people who read the book of Revelation differently. And the problem some would raise would be, why all of a sudden do we interpret two literal witnesses and fire coming out of their mouth in a literal way? Of course, most would never say fire is literally coming out of their mouth. They then would become symbolic at that point. So the point is, we're looking at hermeneutics, we're looking at interpretation. And I think scholars are going to differ. So let me just conclude by saying, having worked through the Greek of this text, and I hope someone might enjoy this following in the Greek. It's a nice Greek. It's not a difficult Greek, that is John's Greek and Revelation. But the one interpretation is that it's looking at a future tribulation period where there will be two literal witnesses, probably Elijah and Moses, and they'll carry out this, and they will be killed, and they'll arise, and there will be this, can I say, amazement on the part of those that witness it. And it is believed that's one viewpoint. The other viewpoint is that these two witnesses are symbolic of the law and the prophets, especially if we take it as Elijah and Moses. And Christ has fulfilled that. And Christ is in the church. And the church then is experiencing these things. And they try to preach the truth. And it's like fire, but it is opposed by the world system, by the Roman emperor worship system, and all the way through history has been opposed. That is the witness of Christ in the church. And but I think this viewpoint is saying, even though the church, Christ in the church, is treated in a very, very bad way, the church revives. And the bodies, people think it's all over. But the good news is the church can never be destroyed because Christ is in the church. He's the one that's making that, and he's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets of Moses and Elijah. And we're told by Jesus that I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So it continues to move on with the revivals through history, not only in the first century, but through history, finalizing in the second advent of Christ and the final judgment that opens the way to what we see at the end of this chapter. So I'll stop there, and I hope this is helpful to see the different perspectives and the Greek, of course.